The Minnesota Vikings are cursed. That's no secret. The Vikings have lost all 4 Super Bowls they've been to, lost the 6 NFC Championship games they've been to since their last Super Bowl loss, and have had 2 seasons where they had the best kicker in the league just to see their season come to an end when that kicker missed. The part we don't know, however, is where this curse came from. We used to think we had it figured out, but the original curse theory was proven wrong, and every good sports curse needs an origin story. Whether it's the Red Sox trading Babe Ruth, the Cubs and that goat, or the Browns and Brownie the elf. Well, I have found the origin of the Vikings curse and why it seems to have changed so much from their early days in the 70s, losing all those Super Bowls, to the last 50 years where they can't even make it back to the Super Bowl. It's one hell of a heartbreaking ride. Let's get into it.
Sports are history.
Now this video is going to be a 2-parter, seeing as the script got a little long and I've already made a way too long video on the history of the Minnesota Vikings. So in part 1 here, we will go over the Vikings Super Bowl era and how and why it was so cursed. And then in part 2, we will see how that Super Bowl curse morphs into like an NFC playoff curse, right? Okay, we'll start with where people originally thought the curse came from and why that theory has since been disproven. It all has to do with the Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy. What is the Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy? Well, it's the trophy that was given to the NFL champion prior to the 1970 NFL-AFL merger. Quick history lesson, it will be important. In 1970, the NFL would merge with a rival league, the American Football League, or the AFL, and they would become one league and retain the name National Football League, or the NFL. The teams that did make up the NFL would now be the National Football Conference, or the NFC, and the teams that made up the AFL would now be the American Football Conference, or the AFC, and they make up the 2 conferences we still have today in the NFL. But prior to all this, in 1969, the last team to win that NFL championship and get that Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy was the Vikings. And then they'd immediately lose the Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy, and losing it would curse them. See, the Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy, it's not like the Lombardi Trophy where they just make a new one for the winner each year. No, this one would get passed to the new winner each year, and their names would be inscribed on the trophy like the Stanley Cup. So the Vikings didn't just lose their championship trophy, they lost the trophy for all of the champions prior to them. Or at least since 1934 when the trophy was introduced. And for some reason, not the 1960 Eagles, they weren't put on the trophy. But immediately after winning and then losing the trophy, they would go on to lose Super Bowl 4, and that started a stretch of them losing 4 Super Bowls in 8 years. So the theory was a pretty good one. You lost the Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy, and now you were cursed to never do better. But there was a problem with this theory. See, in 2015, the Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy was found, and it wasn't the Vikings who had it. It was their bitter rivals, the Green Bay Packers.
Yes, fuck them Packers. Yes, fuck them Packers.
Yeah, the trophy was found buried away somewhere in the Packers Hall of Fame, which means that the Vikings never actually received the trophy, and neither did the team that won it the year before them, 1968, the Baltimore Colts, because even back then, no one gave a fuck about the Ed Thorpe Memorial Trophy. See, the Packers won it in 1967, and after they did, there wasn't really room left on the trophy to inscribe another name. Plus, the Super Bowl came around in 1966, so the Packers probably figured, who's really going to miss this thing? And seeing as, the Colts and the Vikings don't even remember if they got it and then lost it, they were right. Where was I? Oh, right. The point is, if the Vikings never received it and therefore never lost it, then why are they cursed? Well, for a curse as bad as the Vikings, we need to go to the very creation of the team itself before they even landed on the name the Vikings. See, in the late 50s, the NFL was seeing a boom in popularity that was heavily spurred on by the 1958 NFL Championship game, a game commonly referred to as the greatest game ever played. It was between the New York Football Giants and the Baltimore Colts, and a great game it was. Many often point to it as the start of football becoming so popular in America, or pro football anyways. After this game, many wealthy individuals were wanting to purchase their own NFL franchise. But the NFL was afraid to oversaturate the market and did not want to expand past the 12 teams it had. Seems wild now. But in 1959, one of the wealthy individuals that the league had turned down, Lamar Hunt, decided to get together with some of the other wealthy individuals the league had turned down and start their own American Football League, which they would call the American Football League. Creative. First, Lamar would have his own team, in Dallas. Then he called up his fellow Texas Allman, Bud Adams, in Houston to join on as the second team. They then called Bob Howsam in Denver to get their third team. And then they made a call up to Minneapolis and got Max Winter, one of the owners of the Minneapolis Lakers, to join in as the fourth AFL franchise.
The number of the day is 4.
Max Winter had also been turned down by the league, so he happily joined on when given the opportunity to be in this new American Football League. He would also get his business partner, Bill Boyer, to join him in owning the team. They then got H.P. Skoglund, and man, wouldn't it have been cool if his name was Skoland. Just need to drop that G. Anyways, they got him as a minority owner and would later even add 2 more minority owners in Bernie Ritter and this other guy who I'm not kidding, his name was Old Hogsrud. Old Hogsrud, who I'm pretty sure was an actual Viking. Eventually, the AFL would settle on 8 teams to start their new league, and the market they saw as the most crucial to nail down was the middle of the country, because the NFL, well, it had no presence in the middle of the country at this time. Between Chicago and California, there was just nothing. So the 2 cities they saw as being, key to locking this market down was Lamar's Dallas in the south and up north, Minneapolis. In fact, when the 8 owners of these new AFL teams got together, they decided that Minneapolis was so important, it would become the host city for their very first AFL draft, and Minneapolis would go on to host the very first AFL draft. Which may be a little confusing to some, seeing as there was never an AFL team anywhere in Minnesota. See, these AFL owners, or the Foolish Club as they called themselves for their seemingly foolish attempt to take on the NFL, well, they had more money than the owners of the NFL did, and that scared the NFL because it meant they could provide some real competition. So the NFL now became very open to the idea of expanding the league.
Look at all the sports space.
The NFL would try to, kill this league before it could even get started, and the first idea to achieve this would just be to buy out the AFL, or at least half of it. They approached Lamar Hunt with an offer to buy 4 teams and allow them in the NFL. But Lamar, having made a deal with 8 teams and not 4, turned down the offer. He wasn't going to turn his back on those other 4 teams. Lamar knew that, the NFL's next approach would just be to go and poach these teams individually. So he got together with the other AFL owners and they all decided that they wouldn't take any offers from the NFL, knowing that, just one of them leaving, it could be quite severe to this new, young, burgeoning league. And the NFL would try just that. They tried to buy out Bud Adams in Houston, and Bud would turn them down, saying, quote, "I am a man of my word." When asked why he turned them down, they would offer Baron Hilton, the LA owner, yes, that Hilton of the celebrity porn fame, they offered him a 50% stake in the Rams, which he turned down. We will fast forward to the eve of the AFL draft, when all of the AFL owners were convening in a Minneapolis hotel preparing for the draft. Harry Weismer, the New York owner of the AFL would come storming into that Minneapolis hotel room carrying a newspaper that said, Minneapolis to get an NFL franchise. And that is how the rest of the AFL owners found out that Max Winter, Bill Boyer, and the other Minnesota owners had turned their back on the AFL and accepted an offer from the NFL. This was a huge blow to the new league, one that almost ended it in its infancy. Not only did the NFL take what was supposed to be a crucial market for the AFL, they did so the night before their very first draft and in the city that was hosting the draft. This backstabbing to an entire league, one where many of the owners had turned down the very offer Minnesota was now accepting. Well, it's not just where the history of the Vikings starts in the NFL. It's where the curse of the Vikings was born. They stabbed the entire AFL in the back. It was a heartbreaking blow to this new league, and it cursed the Vikings to never have ultimate success against this league, the AFL, which would eventually become the AFC. And it also cursed the Vikings to be the most heartbreaking NFL team of all time. Now, I did say they would never have ultimate success against the AFL/AFC, so you may just call it a Super Bowl curse, seeing as the Vikings actually have a winning record all time against the AFC. But that's actually just very fitting irony for the Vikings' heartbreak. See, a part of this curse is that there always has to be some irony or coincidence baked into their heartbreak. Usually it involves something that seems like it should be great for the Vikings, but just bites them in the ass at the end and, makes it that much more heartbreaking. Kind of like, the AFL thinking it had one of its major cities locked down, just to see him pull out at the 11th hour and get stabbed in the back by that market. So call it a Super Bowl curse if you'd like, but even then, who coined the name Super Bowl? Yeah, Lamar Hunt. Now, I know people will see what I'm surrounded by and think that I'm just a biased Chiefs fan. And they're not wrong, but I'm going to do everything I can to put my bias aside and bring you just the facts. Being the scientifically minded individual that I am, as I do a video on curses, I know how important it is for any good theory to be supported with facts. So let's get into the evidence. Now, as alluded to, there's the number 4, which comes up a lot for them, especially in their early days. Now, I'm not normally one for numerology, but it's pretty hard to ignore in this case. So let's get out the 4 counter.
Who could ask for more?
Just not a counter that goes up to the number 4. It's there to count the number of times we see the number 4 pop up. You get it. Okay, so first they were the 4th team to join the AFL before stabbing them in the back and becoming the 14th team in the NFL. In the Vikings' 4th postseason game ever, we would see the curse for the first time, and it was in Super Bowl 4, which they would lose, and then 4 years later, go back to the Super Bowl and start a 4-year stretch of losing 3 Super Bowls to give them a total of 4 Super Bowl losses. In all of these Super Bowls, they would be held scoreless for at least the first 40 minutes, and their offense would only have a total of 4 scoring drives. That's right. In 4 Super Bowls, their offense would only score 4 times. But at least they're all touchdowns. And in their first 4 opportunities to win a game and go to a Super Bowl, they won. I'm talking the 1969 NFL Championship game and the first 3 NFC Championship games they played in. They went a perfect 4-0 just to go 0-4. And since then, they haven't won a single NFC Championship game. Oh, and I almost forgot. The Vikings had the 4th highest win percentage of any team in the 70s, the best decade for the Vikings franchise. The 3 teams ahead of them are the Dolphins, Raiders, and Cowboys, all of whom won a Super Bowl in the 70s by, beating the Vikings either in a Super Bowl or NFC Championship game. Now, I also need a little more than numerology to back up a theory, and a curse really needs to tell a story. So let's go to the first time we see this curse in Super Bowl IV. And who would the Vikings lose that game to? Yeah, the team owned by the founder of the league they stabbed in the back, Lamar Hunt and his still AFL Chiefs. Now, so with the very last opportunity that his AFL had, right, in its very last year, Lamar Hunt's team would go to a Super Bowl to face the team that stabbed him in the back. And winning this game would also prove that the AFL was every bit as good as the NFL, seeing as, winning it would forever give the AFL and NFL a 2-2 record against each other in Super Bowls. Not only that, but the Vikings were heavily favored in this Super Bowl. They were 12-point favorites, so the Chiefs winning this would be quite the upset. See, in the 1969 season, the Vikings weren't just the best team in the NFL, they were one of the best teams the NFL had ever seen. They had the best offense and defense in the league. Their offense scored more points than any other team that year and put up 50 points in 3 games, which is still tied for the record for the most 50-point games in a season, and this was back when there were only 14 games. But their defense was even better. They held opposing teams to 9.5 points per game, which is still second all time. The Vikings had a 12-game winning streak, which was the longest the league had seen in 35 years. In the only 2 games the Vikings lost that year, they didn't have their starting quarterback for either of them. So they were completely undefeated against the NFL in games where their starting quarterback played. Meanwhile, the Chiefs in the AFL didn't even win their own division. No, they went into the playoffs as a wild card team. And, the AFL was already seen as an inferior league, so the Vikings were understandably 12-point favorites. And yet the Chiefs would beat them 23-7, and the game was never close. This Super Bowl was a huge point of pride for Lamar and his league. And going into this Super Bowl, Lamar had not forgotten what the Vikings ownership had done. From an account on ProFootballHallOfFame.com, Jack Stedman, a longtime Chiefs general manager in this era, was at dinner with Lamar the Wednesday before Super Bowl IV and said that, quote, "Everyone was all fired up after reading and hearing all week how the poor Chiefs didn't have a chance against the mighty Vikings. Lamar began talking about how the Minnesota owners had double-crossed him and the other AFL owners in November of 1959 by pulling out and accepting an NFL franchise. He would pound on the table and yell, 'Kill, kill, kill!'" A little dramatic, admittedly, but it lets you know that the backstabbing, it was not just seen as men doing business. The Vikings ownership had been pushed heavily by George Halas, the, Bears' longtime owner and basically the de facto head of the NFL in this day. Well, he was heavily pushing the Minnesota owners to join his league. He was saying it's the more established league. It's where you want it to be in the first place. And heck, if you don't join us, well, we'll start our own team in Minneapolis anyways. But none of this was unique to Minnesota. Right? All of the AFL owners had wanted to be in the NFL in the first place, and half of them had turned down an offer from the NFL. They were also getting threats. Lamar and Bud Adams were both getting threats that the NFL was going to put a team in their cities, and the LA and New York owners were already dealing with competing NFL teams. So the other AFL owners didn't just see this as men doing business. They felt betrayed by the Minnesota owners. In the book, The Good, the Bad, the Ugly Minnesota Vikings, they would give the account of Harry Weismer coming into that Minneapolis hotel room the night before the draft. And, instead of showing the paper to everyone right away, he came in steaming, and somebody would ask Harry Weismer if he was ready for dinner, to which, according to the book, Harry Weismer hesitated for a second. He looked around the room and dramatically answered the question. "Yes, and it's the Last Supper. And there's Judas," pointing at Max Winter. Again, a little dramatic, but God, I hope it's true, because, it really just drives home the point that this was seen as a personal betrayal to the other AFL owners. The Chiefs coach, Hank Stram, in Super Bowl IV would write the blueprint on how to beat the Vikings in Super Bowls. We see his offensive game plan used in the first 3 Super Bowls to beat the Vikings, and his defensive game plan used in all 4 of the Vikings Super Bowls to beat them. His game plan would go perfectly with the Vikings Curse. It would be to take what should be great for the Vikings and use it against them. On offense, he used the aggression of the Vikings' all-time great defensive line, the Purple People Eaters, and, turned it against them, getting them to over-pursue on run plays by using cross and trap blocking, end-arounds, and misdirections. The Dolphins and Steelers would do the same thing to great success.
Here's the pursuit. Good fake to the outside. Sutherland never did see the handoff.
Al, you remember when Kansas City beat Minnesota in the Super Bowl championship? They used a lot of similar kind of plays, the reverses. They had Otis Taylor coming back on the route on the outside. Frank Pitts did the same thing, but Minnesota is a pursuit kind of team. They've depended on their front four a lot in the last few years. The linebackers pursue real strong, so if you can usually get around that defensive end, whether it be Eller or Marshall, you've got a pretty good gainer.
The Raiders wouldn't need to do that so much, as they had 2 Hall of Fame linemen on the left side of their O-line that could just simply overpower anyone, including that great Purple People Eater defensive line. Now, on defense, they would all use the same tactic that Stram wrote up. They would put their nose tackle right over Vikings Hall of Fame center Mick Tingelhoff, also a Hall of Fame name. Mick Tingle-Me-Hoff was what was known as a Greyhound center, and they were widely used in this era of the NFL. They were smaller, athletic centers that could get off the ball quickly and get to the second line of the defense to block opposing linebackers, which was a big part of the Vikings' run game. But the AFL/AFC, they used bigger guys, especially on the defensive line. The Chiefs had their Hall of Fame defensive tackle Curly Culp line up nose-to-nose with Mick all game, and Mick could not block him one-on-one.
That particular time, Culp was lined up in front of the offensive center for Minnesota, Mick Tingelhoff, and that's the defense that we talked about that Minnesota is not used to looking at. It occupies the center, who usually is sort of an optional blocker.
And this is what the other 3 Vikings Super Bowl opponents did to them as well. Their D-tackle would line up nose-to-nose with Mick and watch them tingle his Hoff all day. And not in the way you want to be tingled Hoff, but with sandpaper. This forced the Vikings to use a guard to help Mick, and it really just freed up their opponents, other defensive linemen and linebackers to hunt the Vikings running backs and quarterbacks all game long. And, it worked pretty great, seeing as the Vikings only had 4 scoring drives in those 4 Super Bowls. Now, the last part of the story to really round out that early Vikings curse, was when the Vikings left the AFL at the altar the night before the draft. The AFL still drafted players to that Minnesota team, not knowing what city or state they'd be playing for, and that team would become the Oakland Raiders, the last team to beat the Vikings in a Super Bowl. So the Vikings perfectly bookended their Super Bowls by first losing to the team that was owned by the founder of the league they stabbed in the back, and then last by losing to the team created from that backstabbing. The team that should have been the Vikings. But there's a little more. This may not be as convincing at first, but it seems there is a Cowboys thread tied to their curse. I know, nobody wants to see the Cowboys pop up anywhere, but especially not in a curse. Now, see, the Cowboys were the other team solely created by the NFL to compete with the AFL. That's why they were placed in Dallas, actually, to directly compete with Lamar's team. They would come around in 1960, the very first year of the AFL, and the Vikings would come around a year later in 1961. The Vikings' biggest playoff competitor in the 70s, the best decade for the Vikings, was the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, they actually played the Rams 5 times between 1969 and 1978, and they played the Cowboys 4 times in that period. but they would beat the Rams all but one of those times, where conversely, they would lose to the Cowboys all but one of those times. And 2 of those losses would lead to the Cowboys winning their 2 Super Bowls in the 70s. So, the NFL created 2 teams to compete with the AFL, and in the 70s, those 2 teams would win 2 Super Bowls. But they were both Dallas, and Dallas won each of those by going through the Vikings in the playoffs each time. Also, the 1 year that the Vikings didn't make the Super Bowl in that 4-year stretch of making 3 Super Bowls, that 1 year they lost to the Cowboys. And gosh, they didn't just lose to the Cowboys, they lost in historic fashion with a Hail Mary pass. And not just any Hail Mary pass, but the Hail Mary pass. Yes, the very pass that made the term Hail Mary famous in football. And man, 2 plays before the Cowboys pulled off that Hail Mary pass, the Vikings would have the Cowboys backed up to a 4th and 16. But, the Cowboys would complete a 25-yard pass, because anything that should be great for the Vikings, just makes it that much more heartbreaking. Oh, and the 0-6 streak that the Vikings have been on in NFC Championship games since their last Super Bowl loss, well, it started the very year after their last Super Bowl appearance, and with a loss to the Dallas Cowboys in the NFC Championship game, obviously. But if we keep pulling on this Cowboys thread, man, it's going to take us right into the next part of the Vikings curse, which we'll have to leave for part 2 because this part 1 is already getting way too long. But hey, that Cowboys piece, it may give you some of a hint of where that next part of the curse comes from. Or maybe you want to watch my way too long history on the Minnesota Vikings, where I go over this curse and, well, their entire heartbreaking history. And hey, if I got anything wrong, or if I missed anything, or if you think this whole thing's bullshit, well, then just please let me know in the comments. Maybe give me the old like and subscribe if you're so inclined to, and I'll see you in part 2.